Hey guys, it's Christian, your Vancouver realtor, and the topic for today's video is Vancouver, the eviction capital of Canada. So I read an article in the Globe and Mail, and I know this journalist is well-meaning and she cares. But the problem with this kind of journalism is that it presents a very one-sided point of view with no context. And that you see that a lot in print journalism these days. And it's articles like this which makes me want to cancel my subscription to the Globe and Mail. It's just a intellectually dishonest presentation of the issue. And so what I wanted to do is really take a look at some of the assertions in this article on evictions in Canada, and let's dig deeper. Let's look underneath the hood and see if what this person is writing about is really true. So the report, the article cites a report that says 10.5% of Vancouverites are evicted every year, and so meaning kicked out by their landlords, and that this is twice as high as Toronto or Montreal, where it's half that. And they talked to a UBC professor, and he shares that, you know, at one point in his life, he was kicked out twice in a short 5-year period, and he knows and he empathizes with how hard it is on tenants when your landlord renovicts you or is selling the property, and you know that forces you to leave. I get all that. We understand all of that. But where this article really misses the boat is that it provides no context. So the first question we want to ask is, what's the social milieu? What have the last 3-4 years been like? What kind of government policies have we seen? What kind of restrictions on landlords have we seen? And that's going to paint a bigger picture and maybe explain to us why we are also seeing a lot more Vancouverites getting evicted now. So let's start with the first thing here. Costs for landlords. I mean, anybody, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you know that inflation right now is running at 4%. The costs for everything have been going up. Insurance is going up, strata fees is going up, property taxes is going up. I did the numbers on this, and it looks like it costs about $3,000 more a year for a landlord investor to hold a condo. This is $3,000 more obviously than it was 3 years ago. And what else has happened at this time? Well, obviously we have seen the province of BC, the NDP government, has brought in a number of restrictions on landlords and how much they can increase the rent that they can get. So at first it used to be you could, as a landlord, you could raise the rent every year, right? And you could raise it by, inflation plus 2%. And the government cut back on that and said, no, you can only now raise it by inflation. Then the government cut back on that and says, and put in a total freeze during the 2020, the year of the coronavirus. Well, that's fine. You know, there's a lot of maybe restaurant staff, hotel workers, they lost their jobs. And of course, they needed a little bit of help. Great. So we put a freeze on rental increases. But that doesn't also help the landlords it doesn't help the landlords. Now, the new rule, and this is going to be 2022, the BC government is saying you can only increase the rent by 1.5%. So you have all these other costs, but you're not allowed to increase your rent. So it just doesn't make, landlords are asking, can I make an extra $3,000 a year in rent to cover the additional $3,000 in costs? And if you can't, you know, it doesn't become as attractive for you. You think about selling it, and when a landlord investor sells the unit, there's a good chance that the end user is going to want to move into it, which means the tenant gets evicted. So that's what's happening here. I think that's a lot of what's happening. I know that, for example, of my buyer clients in 2021, that most of them, I would say 90%, have been end users. That means they're buying for themselves, for their families. They are not buying as investors. That's a smaller percentage of buyers. I find a lot of investors these days are going towards pre-sale units. So anyway, the point of this is that it's not always what you read online. Second part, they talk about renovictions in this article. So renoviction is when the landlord says, look, I'm going to be changing the floors, the cabinets, and you, Mr. Tenant, you got to get out. Obviously, there's a formal process. You've got to file paperwork with the tenant. That is not very easy to do. And the article here, the journalist does not give us one example of this. They don't talk to one single tenant or landlord that shares their point of view. And it's just wide sweeping statements. But renovictions are tough to do. I mean, there's really only 3 reasons that you can boot a tenant out or that you can get the boot from your landlord. Number 1, your landlord is moving into the unit. Second, the landlord's parents or children are moving into the unit. Or third, they're doing substantial renovations. By the way, you now as a landlord have to get what's called an order of possession. And you have to have your permits in place if you need any. And then you apply to the Rental Tenancy Bureau of BC for a hearing, whereby the arbitrator hears the request and then determines whether or not the tenant has to leave for those renovations to get done. Because in most cases, if you're changing the floors, the cabinets, swapping out appliances, obviously the tenant doesn't have to leave, right? The tenant could keep living there. And so it's an onerous bar to have to climb and jump. And I don't see it all that often. In all my years in real estate, I've never come across a single person, certainly none of my clients, who have ever renovicted their tenants. And if they ever tried to do that, something like that, I'd tell them not to, because that's not the way you do things. But anyway, it just kind of explains a little bit more of the background of what's happening here. I think the main point is that this journalist is just completely off base and then goes on to sort of villainize investors, landlords. Here's a direct quote from the piece. From the growth of income inequality and wealth in Canada since the 1990s allows a minority of Canadians, perhaps the top 5%, to fully engage in the rampant, highly profitable financial exploitation of the rest of Canadians who simply desire a good place to live, appropriate to their needs, at a price that they can afford. Wow. I mean, you read that, that is as left-wing as it gets. I gotta say that is too extreme for a journalist to be quoting a professor and writing like that. I mean, I think a lot of this depends on your point of view. And there are people who think like this. I don't think it's healthy for you to think like this. It reminds me of a story. A couple of years ago, I went out with a friend. We had dinner here in the West End. And he told me, he said, Christian, I just feel like landlords are exploiting their tenants. And I remember just being struck, like as if you hit me with a brick. I couldn't believe that was the lens through which he looked at the tenant-landlord relationship. If that's how you see, I mean, this is not, a kids, cleaning chimneys in the 1850s for 12 hours a day. This is a tenant-landlord relationship in, 21st century Vancouver. It's not one of exploitation. And certainly myself, as a landlord, I don't see myself in that light. I have bought a unit, I've renovated it, it's got a beautiful view, nice renovation. The tenants I've always rented it to loved the unit, practically begged me for it, and really appreciated the fact that if anything ever broke, I would have a handyman over there same day fixing it. If they ever have any issues with it, they can call me and talk to me about it. I mean, we really take care of our tenants, and I find most people do, certainly. My clients take really good of their tenants and respect their tenants because in many ways your tenant's your client. Why wouldn't you do that? And I think these types of articles that you read online, they really miss this nuance that there could be other reasons, such as more onerous government regulations, higher taxes, higher fees, and when it comes to strata and insurance and property taxes. There's a whole bunch of other things going on here. Now, let's do one other thing. Let's ask the question, what are home ownership rates? What have they been over the last 3, 4, 5 decades? And when I looked at Canada, I could see there's about 68% of Canadians own their own home. So about 2/3. And I compared that with about 20 to 30 years ago, and it was roughly the same. But just to make sure that we've got our numbers right, I did a cross comparison with the United States. Okay, so you can see the home ownership rates here in the United States. Going all the way back to the mid-1960s, 63%. So 2/3 of Americans, which is almost the same as in Canada, would own their own home. And it sort of hit a peak around 2005 when it was just before the subprime crisis, where 69% of Americans own their own home. And then now it's back to 64%-ish. So what that tells us is that, generally speaking, at any point in time in society, there's about 2/3 of people, at least in North America, over the last 50 years, 2/3 of people own their own home and 1/3 doesn't. Now, why do they not own their own home? There could be a number of factors there. They lack the ability or they lack the willingness. And it's usually those two. And from what I've observed from people who've come into my open houses over the years, when I ask them, well, why don't you want to own a home? The responses I've received are, well, I don't want the responsibility of a mortgage, or I might leave the city, or I want to use my money for other things like traveling around the world and vacations. And all of that's fine. But it just, at the end of the day, if you really want to own a home, you can. There is no such thing as exploitation. And certainly you don't need to rent a place you don't want. I think the final point here is just to kind of understand some basic economics. It's that, look, investors buy condos out of self-interest, right? They want an investment return. But when they do that, they provide a benefit to society. The benefit is, if I go out and buy 2 units and I rent them out, 2 people now have homes. So there's a benefit of society. Now, you may be familiar with this concept. It's called the invisible hand in economics, right? My self-interest provides a benefit to the rest of society. And that's it. That's how it works. And when the government gets too heavy-handed with regulations and taxes, you start to lose the incentive for individual investors to invest. And they will either take their units sell them, and then you lose those units which could have been in the rental pool. So that's something to really keep in mind. We don't want all investors walking away. So I hope that helps explain a little bit about what you're reading online and whether or not it's really justified. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up or subscribe, and we'll see you next time.